Good evening. I'm glad you could all make it at short notice. This, on paper, could be extremely boring. I'm going to talk about car parking design. I'll try. You'll see there's some very interesting things here, and I'll try and make it as lively as possible. When I started hanging around in car parks, sort of late at night in the middle of the last decade, it was sort of roughly the same time a fashion for how people meet. Casual sexual partners also started to take off. So it was an intriguing scenario where I would explain to people I needed to be around with my camera taking photographs of what was going on in their car parks late at night. And it wasn't just me that was aware of that. English partnerships that commissioned this publication, they began to call it internally, even at their senior management meetings, the Dogging Project. So this was the publication. It was a challenge at the time. It was kind of brave challenge, and I think it's sort of not particularly well recognised, because EP was the agency that used to buy land from the MOD and then sell it for the government and had to mark up a profit out of that purchase. So they had to essentially manufacture value out of the sites that EPs were taking from MOD, NHS, everyone else. And what tended to happen was they would take sites that the house builders wanted and then introduce a series of design standards on them that the house builders didn't necessarily want to work to. And then on top of everything else, they were supposed to enforce what was believed to be 1.5 parking bays, which was the PPG3 standard at the time. And the house builders were increasingly aware of the fact that this was a big problem for their purchasers, that they were getting more and more market resistance, and especially at the top end of the market, where anybody that had 2 or more cars in their family were almost invariably resisting that type of design. So EP didn't want to have sites in places like Cheshire, where everybody drives to work, and everybody has 2 BMWs if possible, that they could not sell to the people that were going to make those sites work for them. So they asked one of their people to create a brief or a guide that would essentially look at capacity, how you could build capacity, what you could do with capacity, and how you might make car parking work in a way that wouldn't necessarily directly challenge central government's 1.5, but would at least show ways round. And as you'll see from the research that came quite a lot later, they were exactly on the button with that particular angle. So this is actually a research project I'm going to talk you through. This was an old publication now, 2006. I think you can still download it online. But there's a brand new version of it that this now feeds into. And I just want to say, before I go too far in this, the 2 people that follow me, Bob White and Graham, are the experts on this. They know so much more about us than this, and they framed this research and they gave us most of the ideas for this research. In particular, Bob, as you'll see, was beavering away at this in the background in such a way he created the most amazing data set that we could just plug into. So this is the premise. It's a piece of work under the Sheffield University Home Improvements. They call it Home Improvements. It's effectively a network of research contracts looking at ways of improving housing design. This one was actually done by the Sheffield University. Urbed were the principal contractors. We helped, and Bob White helped just as much as we did again. This is the basic premise. The reduction of parking provision, as in reducing the number of bays on site, doesn't necessarily reduce car ownership. And indeed, it might just lead to a series of unintended consequences for the environment and community relations. And that was the premise, and we got the evidence straight away. We went out and see the sites. You see visible evidence of tensions on all these developments, things like this. You see, far more baroque stuff than that. There are people who've had special signs made at great expense. But it doesn't necessarily happen in cities. So think in terms of this as being a sort of extra urban phenomenon, and in particular a problem, I think, for the sort of satellite towns around London, like Chelmsford, Guildford and Tunbridge. And the methodology was a literature review, and part of the literature review was looking at Kent's data. Now this is the extraordinary thing. Under Bob White, Kent had collected 402 live surveys of people's perceptions of the places where they live in terms of the quality and the car parking. And you'll see some of the data on that in a moment. But think in terms of this, 402 schemes that they had researched over a period of about 7 years. And in all of these schemes are at least 50 units, some of them 500. So we're talking about a data sample that was running into 70,000. And from that, we then went into a mini focus group situation where we went to look at 12 of the developments that we liked the look of, and then we tested some ideas on them. So these are the key findings. I mean, just to remind you, this only needs 1 second on the screen. Car ownership has been pretty inexorable in terms of its rise. It dips every now and again when you get a major economic weakness, but it then recovers. You saw this in 2010, 2011. It was incredibly easy to buy a new car if you could borrow the money because they would give you a fantastic deal. It dipped slightly and then it started to surge again. And this year, apparently, we're going to get a record level again. And one of the things that David Rydland did was he tried to, working as the main contractor, sort of bracket everything that's ever gone on with car and housing design into these four ages. The first age might be when the car suddenly arrived on the scene. So we were designing schemes of Letchworth type qualities from about 1900 onwards, not really expecting the car to turn up. You could see, there weren't that many around at the time. And they arrived. And as they arrived, we began to accommodate them. And we went very quickly into this kind of panic about the speed with which we were accepting them. These statements from the time, and you get these wonderful expressions which are familiar from all the books that were written, and these great images showing how we should create these sort of divided worlds to the Abercrombie plan. And then you get the design and the layouts of the period where you get the straight route through the middle with underpasses for the pedestrians going under it, no direct access from the houses, classic Radburn layouts, lots of paths weaving through. I don't know, this is one of David's pictures. I think this is in the States, but it's not Radburn because I know Radburn's a different style. The third age of the car, along it comes to the 1990s. It has a lot actually to do with Graham's involvement with I think responsive environments, where it was sort of suggesting that there's got to be a better way of creating streets. And I think perhaps, it was certainly not Graham's intention, there's sort of impression that it gave to people was perhaps it might have been an idea to create streets that were more responsive by just simply narrowing them. And I know that's not where he was coming from. But we moved very quickly towards something along the lines of Poundbury. And then after that, the fourth age of the car, which is where we are at the moment, where we've got a Secretary of State who's promised to end the war on motorists. So if you look at where we are and where we might be going, we have arrived at a point with a big consultation in the last couple of days where I think they're going to set quite different standards for what should be done. This is the Kent data, though, and I think it's really interesting to go through this a little bit in detail, but not too much. You've got your 12 different planning authorities. Watch for the two, Canterbury and Shepway. But when you look at the number of schemes that were surveyed in these, I was saying these tally up to 402, you can see, in the district of Canterbury, you've got 65 schemes alone. It's absolutely incredible, the size of the sample. And then, out of this, you can extrapolate the average number of cars for households. And the funny thing is, the first thing that comes out of this is 1.547 is less than the 1.5 you're supposed to design to. So on paper, the research that went into PPG3 and the anticipation of those numbers was probably correct. That is about the right size. The question is what type of parking. It's not necessarily the provision. And this again will show you the tension here between this, because if you actually look at the average level of car ownership, there's a lot of these households where they've got less than 1.5. It's only by the time you get up to 6 habitable rooms that you start to get on average more than 1.5. So there's a huge percentage of households for whom that type of cap would have worked. And then if you go into some of the detail on this, on the actual amount that's provided, we know from the figures that we've got exactly the provision across all of these. This is the average. So you've got this 2.12 spaces on average were provided for, on average, 1.47 cars. And when you go back, I said, watch out for Canterbury and Shepway. Canterbury was on average providing 2.64 bays against 1.57, and Shepway was 2.02 against 1.44. So, it's at Ashford as well. It's Canterbury and Shepway, so my eyes are struggling to align with this. But essentially, you've got several planning authorities that were on average providing more than one extra bay per house. So there really shouldn't be a problem. But if you don't actually analyse how people feel about those places, you can see there's a massive problem. This is one of these surveys where you're essentially given your 5 choices. Are you happy, very unhappy, very happy or unhappy? And then, of course, in the middle you had that don't care kind of thing. It's split. You took a sample of 402 on these developments. In 221 of these developments, people were very unhappy with the parking. And in 85 of them, they were unhappy. So you put those two together, that's actually 76% of these developments, people were angry about car parking. But they weren't angry about everything else. This is not a function of the fact people have bought houses at the top of the market and just wanted out and were angry with the developers and everything about it. Because if you ask them questions about did they think the houses were attractive or the places where they were living were attractive, and was the development a friendly place to live, you've got very positive figures. You know, you add those two together, that's 85% of the people living there. Those developments were happy, or 85% of those developments had a very good satisfaction rating from the people living there. So it's not, the parking issue is not a function of people's general response to the design. It was strictly about the parking. And this slide just shows you really as well how many of the households in these various places had 2 or more cars. Because this is where the problem starts to kick in. The 2 or more car families are the ones that are not satisfied with this type of arrangement, as you'll see in a minute. And you can see that some of them were significantly lower than in others, where you've got very high ratings. But again, you know, Shepway and Canterbury, they were designing for that. They seemed to know that those are the places with the highest provision, that was where the highest provision was needed. And it's one of the clues to what was going on. We asked them about the use of garages. You know, remember they've got 2.12 spaces on average, that the vehicles typically only 1.47 in ownership. So on paper, they should have had that as the surface on average, and then they've got typically this amount that they're parking in the garage, but actually only about 1, is that 1 in 7 or 1 in 8? I can never work it out. About 1 in, between 1 in 7 and 1 in 8 are actually using the garage. So the garage wasn't for parking, the garage was effectively a store for everybody's possessions, their drum kits, their, you know, and increasingly we understand that, you know, they're being used for people almost to rent out. So I'm going to skip this one because this one takes part of the explanation, and this one does as well. But the report goes into this in some detail. The thing to watch out for is just, it doesn't seem to be that it's got anything to do with the quantity. It is purely about the type. And this is worth looking at as well, the way that residents in these developments responded. And here is where we started to go into our focus groups into more detail. So the people we're talking to now, we're not just filling in a questionnaire, they were actually sitting down and going through additional information that we were asking of them. You know, we were saying to them, you know, what kind of things are really important for you? And obviously things like quality of build, the size of the home, were up there in the 90s. But, you know, isn't it interesting that things like the width of the roads came in 1 percentage point higher than the size of the home? And that, I think, is because those people are responding to the stresses in those developments, and they're beginning to understand that it is the problem with the roads and the traffic for them that are actually more significant than the housing, which they kind of relate to because it's not particularly bigger or smaller than anything else, whereas the road problems were. And then we go into the detail about whether they were satisfied or very satisfied. You know, we're getting less than 2 in 5 people saying that they like the width of their roads. I would have thought, you know, 10 years ago, if you'd asked that kind of question, most people would have just shrugged their shoulders. But here they all had strong opinions, could explain exactly what they meant. And you know, you can go into more of the detail. Obviously, everything that's in red is the problem. You know? And if you sort of go down it, the red ones are always to do, and the orange ones are always to do with the business, essentially, of the car. This is where all the crisis is for everybody living in these schemes. You know, how satisfied are they? Again, you're getting very, very low satisfaction rates for the question of the roads. You know, 7% consider the roads to be decent and useful to use. And then again, you know, you go through to the car parking. It's the one with the worst ratings. Then we asked questions about what kind of parking have they got and what kind would they want if they could have whatever they wanted. I think this is quite interesting just to look at this business of, you know, what would they do. How many of them had got a car parked off the road or on the property actually in this street, well, 55% of them had got a single car like that. 29% had got 2 cars. And then we asked them, so within reason, how many cars would you like to park off-road and on your own property here in the street? And 51%, well, I would like to park at least 2 cars off the road. But we also asked them, how many would you do if you wanted to park on the road? And it came in at 44%. We're always told by developers that there's a massive gap between the acceptance of parking on the street or within the curtilage of your plot. I don't consider 7% to be a massive gap. And so there is quite a lot of acceptance, I think, for this sort of feeling that you would park quite happily on the street if you were given the space to do it. And in a minute you'll see that in fact that is almost where most people park anyway, even when they're told not to. So these are the case studies. Just remind you again where the boroughs were, the planning authorities. And you can see the schemes, just quick images of them. This scheme here, Milton Lane, Kings Hill, it's not the Lacuna scheme, which everybody sort of knows because it's incredibly tight and it's very, very dense and so on. The Lacuna scheme actually uses a carport design, which I think deals with some of the problems that this scheme doesn't deal with. It's another problem scheme, but I don't think its rating is as problematic as this one. But if we go through some of this, you'll see essentially the basic details of them. So this is Baker Crescent in Dartford. You can see the 91 houses. And you can see the parking ratio, 164%, including a certain number of visitor bays. And we had people go there 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturdays, because essentially the main time of the week to watch what goes wrong with car parking is from when people wake up on Saturday mornings up until about lunchtime. And this is when everybody's come and stayed over on the Friday night, and everybody's got home and parked outside their car, and they haven't been bothered to go and put it in their garage, because that's when they're most shattered or most tired, 1 o'clock in the morning after they've been to friends or whatever. So that's when parking is its most destructive. So we went there 8 o'clock in the morning, monitored them for 4 hours, photographed them, interviewed them with a lot of data on exactly where everything was. And this is the kind of information we got back. The observed parking, of which parking was not in the designated spaces. So we picked up 76 cars that were parked, 18 of them were in the wrong space. And if you go to the Kent data, it tells you more about this, shows you more detail. All of this is downloadable, by the way. You can go to this in your own leisure. But the thing to watch for this is you can see on the left the colour coding. It shows where the garages were, where the allocated in-curtilage bays were, and then it shows you when the cars were parked in black in accordance with where they were supposed to be, and where the cars were not parked in accordance with the design. In other words, all the ones in red are the ones effectively fly parking on the pavement at the front of their houses. So this is essentially trapping that image with an aerial view showing you where people park. Because the first thing you notice is people just park parallel at the front of their house. They might have a house with a 6 metre wide frontage and they've got a 5 metre long car. They just park straight across the front of their house on the pavement, blocking it for anybody that might be using it. This is case study number 2 in Gravesend. Total parking ratio again, above PPG3 limits. 15% unallocated here, and here we saw 43 cars, of which 6 were parked in the wrong place. But when we talked to the people here, they said that the parking rating was minus 68%. In other words, you get that sort of aggregate score where those for and those against, and that gave us minus 68. And 79% of them said there were parking problems. And if you go again and look at the detail of this, you see that this is quite a simple design where everybody was expected to park in particular places immediately in front of their houses mostly, or in the integral garages, and a lot of people just didn't go for the integral garage. And whether you had side courts like at the top, again I suspect that the person in red at the top right hand corner has decided he doesn't want to park around the corner with his car out of view. This is where things start to step up. I'll just skip through the figures. Again, look, more parking than PPG3 by a long way. We saw 101 cars parked here. We're now up to the situation where 1 in 4 is parked in the wrong place. And the parking rating is going down, and the parking problems reported are going up. And you can see the type of street on the left. And this sort of classic kind of sort of Poundbury, narrow gap between the building line, almost nothing in front of the house except for a pavement, and then straight into the carriageway, which is only 4 metres wide. And you get this kind of classic Poundbury-esque break-up as well, with everything effectively irregular, sort of, there's no orthogonal rectangular shapes at all. We just get the little clips of diamond, the sort of shattered plate glass type thing. And you can see the cars are going everywhere on this. You can see you're really down to 1 in 4 that are fly parked. Next one, Kings Hill. This is the one which is exactly designed to PPG3. Actually, the parking ratio is no worse, the parking rating is no worse than the last one, even though it's got less car parking. But the parking problems are higher, and there's obviously been a lot of tensions, as you can see with the illustration. And then you get to that, and you can see that everybody's trying to park on the main carriageway that runs through the middle, and very few of them are using the courts, which they're intended to use around the back. And then this last two are the most disastrous. Here we've got quite generous parking provision, almost up to 50% above PPG3. Parking rating is just straightforward. Everybody we spoke to was angry. And the parking problem was 100%. Everyone said, I don't like it. And then they went into detail. And this place, actually, people were frightened that they would be able to sell their houses from. They actually said, if I'm coming to sell my house, I'll have to make sure that no one gets to see it on a Saturday morning because they'll know what goes on. And you can see them parked here, there, and absolutely everywhere. There's no kind of sort of rhythm at all to the way the place was designed. It's just gone, and people are just parking where they think is probably the safest place to put their car, where it may not get caught by a vehicle passing by, or it's the closest to their front windows. And then the last one, same story, relatively high provision, parking rating absolutely nil, parking problems absolutely through the roof. And then actually this one, again, we're talking about at least 1 in 4 is in the wrong place. It's a smaller schema, so not quite so many. So these are basic conclusions from the research. We're fairly convinced from the way this throws out, and I think it's been around for a while, that you can't drive down car ownership just by trying to design it out. In suburban housing estates, people just will find another way somehow to get their vehicle in there, and they'll just put it somewhere that isn't particularly social to do it. That's because they regard the car as indispensable, and even where you put reasonable alternatives for them to travel to work, the majority will continue to own the cars. They'll just use them less. So you've still got the parking issue, even if people are not using the vehicles and not adding to their carbon footprint. But this is possibly the areas that needs a lot more work. The number of allocated off-street spaces should match the average level of car ownership. It's inappropriate to design houses that are occupied by single people, and lots and lots of new build houses are bought by single people in their 30s and their 40s, who then move in with one car. Sometimes they have 4 bedrooms and they've got 2 parking bays, but they only have 1 car. And then the same house, 2 doors down, will have 4 bedrooms, and they'll have perhaps 4 people with cars living in it. So there's no flexibility to that design at the moment. There's no way of accommodating that, which is why you start needing this additional spill out, this sort of 20% minimum on the street. And then the final thing is design guidance has created popular estates, which are partly responsible for the problem. So essentially the look at those places, the sort of Poundbury-esque sort of serendipity of having narrow streets with lovely sort of gables facing each other across just sort of 7 or 8 metre distances. That's creating places that people seem to like, but then that also creates the problem for the car parking, because we don't seem to have worked out what we're going to do with it if we're going to create suburban typologies that are laid out like medieval villages. Now, and this is a kind of classic detail from one of these. This is actually wider than several of the ones I've shown. You get the 4 metre carriageway, but you're also getting an area where you might park in the street and then a pavement. Sorry, that does not, this is a problem using someone else's presentation. This is not the big problem. This is possibly one of the attempted solutions that is not going particularly well. And if you were to, this is the this is an example of the case study that I showed you, where essentially it had the very bad fly parking, 102 houses. If you introduce more parallel on-street parking like we just showed with the previous diagram, instead of just the few bays that we've got here. You know, we've got 4 on street here. You've got a 192% parking ratio. You've got 102 houses. If you change where the parking is allocated, it's redesigned by that's done, you've still got 102 houses, and you've got 176 bays, and you've got 101 on the street now. So you're actually going towards this type of design. So by just widening that street and accommodating that parallel type parking, you can protect the density, you can protect the same rates of coverage, and you can get more on the street, so you can deal with this whole spill out issue. So final recommendation, design and parking guidance should be amended to allow wider streets, more on-street parking and more permeable layouts. Okay, I'll stop there, and Bob will talk you through some of the ways that could be done, and Graham, I'm sure, is going to cover the same stuff as well.